I want to talk about the bigotry that the BBC have been working on as of late. Specifically, the weaponisation of my sexuality in combination with abysmal journalistic integrity. The BBC seem to be doing this thing over the past few years, where they post feigning articles vaguely supporting trans individuals, while at the same time removing support for trans charities and giving airtime to anti-trans hate groups, and releasing hit pieces on LGBT charities that support all of us. I did actually have a video planned a few months ago on the BBC's transphobic bias and their attacks on mermaids, but honestly I didn't even know where was best to start and where to stop, because every time I think about it, a new situation from them happens. Case in point, this article. I want to be clear where I stand on genital preferences and my experiences with them. Genital preferences are valid. Nobody has to sleep with anybody that they don't want to, and you'd be hard-pressed to actually find anyone who thought so. However, genital preferences are not a sexuality, and it's an extremely persistent lesbophobic myth perpetuated by radical feminists and political lesbians that it's inherent to being a lesbian. And it's not something that cis lesbians sit around discussing often. I've met bi people with genital preferences, and who are deeply transphobic to anybody who doesn't conform to cis normativity. Gay men who say that they hate vaginas are all over the place, and God knows that there are enough cis straight people out there who make it known that as women they love penises and hate other women's vaginas, or that as men the thought of somebody else's dick makes them vomit. But because for years, thanks to political lesbians, my sexuality has been seen as a choice women make to get away from penises and men, some people think that it is intrinsically linked to lesbians. You can be a lesbian and have a genital preference, but you aren't a lesbian just because you have a genital preference. I've seen bi women who invalidate us and call themselves lesbians because they'd only date transgender men, and that's just sometimes the woke version of the same bioessentialist transphobic rhetoric. If you feel like your sexuality is defined by other people's genitals, I have to question why anybody would want to be in a relationship with you. Not being attracted to a certain type of body part is fine. Not sleeping with someone because of that preference is fine. But it isn't a sexuality in the same way that a racial preference, or not liking a specific accent, or not wanting to date a disabled person isn't a sexuality. People's body parts aren't their genders. And even TERFs can agree with that sentiment, considering how often they like to pretend intersex people don't exist. But sexual preferences don't exist in a vacuum, and many should be open to criticism when relevant. Racial preferences, genital preferences, ableist preferences are often informed by the biases of the society that we live in and influenced by bigotry. This hits personally because political lesbians have done nothing but harm lesbians for decades. For years, my sexuality was seen as a choice, by virtue of being the only sexuality not including men in some way. Women known as political lesbians have chosen to call themselves lesbians because it makes them feel less tied to men and the patriarchy.
I also think it's symptomatic that Dworkin identifies as a lesbian, but in that second wave political way. Quoting from the foreword, to Dworkin, it was a badge of rebellion against the patriarchy. In 30 plus years of knowing her, I've never heard of a single romance with a woman, not one. This is not surprising to me from the author of a 250-page book about sex that not once pauses to even imagine the possibility of intimacy between women. Because it's not a lesbianism that's about saying yes to women. It's a lesbianism that's about saying no to men. You know, people think that lesbians are the biggest man-haters, but I don't think that's true. I think lesbians just don't think about men that much. The only men I think about are Fred Nietzsche and Oedipus the King. It's straight women who are usually the real man-haters, because they're stuck with this, and love is closer to hatred than neutrality.
When I speak on this next section, I want to make it clear that I am speaking as a survivor of sexual assault by both cis men and women. I've potentially been groped by more cis women than I have men. I've been groped by straight women under the guise of being jealous. I've been groped by bisexual women while doing my job for the sake of turning on their male partners. I was in an abusive relationship with a bi woman whose main form of abuse was sexual pressure. I've been groped by cis lesbians who would cry if I didn't reciprocate. And I want to say it is absolutely never the fault of anybody sexually assaulted or coerced into sex. My last video should make that 100% clear. And the stigmatization of people who are assaulted by their own gender is real. And yeah, there are trans women who are sexual predators, and those who perpetuate shit takes about consent. And there are cis women like that too. I've met plenty. But this article isn't about that. It isn't framed as about women who are assaulted by other women and are stigmatized for it. It's framed as the poor, helpless, inherently revolted by penises lesbians who are pressured into sex by trans people claiming to be women. I would like to tie this into my last video where I talked about how rape revenge movies are a product of the cultural zeitgeist they exist in. That Birth of a Nation could be considered a rape revenge film representing the white fears of black men and rape. And I don't think this trend is much different. The portrayal of black men as animal-like rapists is one that has always incited racial hatred and opposition to miscegenation. Trans women are treated in media like men in disguise, with TERFs using terms like woman face. The few cases of trans women assaulting or pressuring other women into sex are held as an example of all of them, and this article is just fuel for that. Because this line of reasoning can be used to argue anything about any group, and always has been. It's gay panic. It's the science that proves black people are inherently more violent, and it's questionable considering that the author seems to have been sitting on this for so long, that this was published in the near immediate aftermath of the Sarah Everard trial and amid reports of drinks by kings and sexual assaults. When many British women are questioning their safety among men, and especially authority figures, a new target is always convenient. Nothing provided in this article meets the BBC's own criteria for journalistic integrity or validity. It presents anecdotes as fact, uses a clearly biased source with poor data, and offers no counter-opinion from any opposition. The more time I leave before I put this out, the more awful information comes out about this article. The survey in question is openly transphobic and didn't limit its tiny sample size to just lesbians, but to gender-critical women in general. One of the cis women cited as concerned about being pressured into having sex with trans women is a known rapist who was publicly outed in her community long before this was released. By the time I hit render on this, it'll probably be discovered that Caroline Lowbridge is a war criminal or something. These articles are written from such a heteronormative point of view. Honestly, cis-het people focus on genital preferences more than any lesbians or gay men I know. When I came out, it was a constant barrage of jokes from straight people about not liking dick. So it's weird that this is the lesbian issue that the BBC focuses on. Considering the epidemic that is the corrective rape of lesbians in part of the world, where are the BBC's articles on people who identify as men trying to pressure lesbians to sleep with them? On Britain and other countries' unfair asylum-seeking processes? On sexual assaults where we are victim-blamed for not shunning men hard enough? Where are the articles on us being treated like commodities to unicorn hunters and fetishised constantly? In 2018, lesbian woman Sydney Loof was murdered by a man and a woman who lured her in on a dating app. Dating apps continue to do little for our safety and often fail to delete profiles by couples and men and offer no way to effectively filter them from seeing your profile. I guarantee you I could get a sample size of lesbians larger than the 80-person sample size of not exclusively lesbians that the BBC used for this article, who say that they feel unsafe on dating apps because of couples. But we won't see that. because actual lesbian issues aren't worth the coverage to the cis straight people trying to stir up hate and division against the trans community. I'm not going to go super in depth about this article. It's been covered by actual journalists and those far better at researching than myself. I will link to multiple debunks and discussions of it, but I do want to talk about this type of coverage. This topic stings especially hard as recently I see this rhetoric being used as a way to separate lesbians from our community in what feels like a deliberate tactic by the gender critical. I want to beg the rest of the LGBT community to not associate lesbians with this. It feeds the lesbophobia that can be pervasive in our community so much. As a result of sentiments like this, I see people in our own community post things that make me feel so isolated. My sexuality has been used by people who aren't lesbians to attack others for so long that the anger is misdirected at inclusive lesbians. I see people say things like, when I see someone call themselves a lesbian, I have to think they're transphobic. This sentiment hits harder when I think about my life as it relates to the gender binary. For a while, I've been thinking of myself as a non-binary lesbian. For my whole life, I was made to feel like I was never woman enough as a lesbian. To be unattracted to and estranged from people who identify as men was to be completely isolated from the binary, never quite meeting its expectations and never quite relating to women who are. I was never able to socialise in the same way that other women were, and that rift only grows bigger the more I think about it and grow older. I feel like my experiences as a lesbian, especially one who realised at a young age, have shaped how I've grown up and related to gender for my whole life, that my gender identity feels incomplete without it. And I feel so much more closely tied to my trans lesbian sisters who have to go through the experience of finding the way that their gender and sexuality intersects than I do to cis women in most ways. And the longer it goes on, it gets to the point that when I say woman, I think of other people instead of myself. But this experience often feels so at odds with other people's relation to the gender binary that it can feel isolating in itself. Other lesbians who are either non-binary or questioning their relation to it understand it perfectly, but many non-binary people who aren't lesbians don't understand. It isn't a new sentiment, but new terminology to explain a relation to sexuality and gender that's always existed. There have always been AFAB butch lesbians who are not trans men, but have lived gender non-conforming lives that they would now call non-binary. There have always been femme lesbians who feel like their gender identity and gender performance is tied to their relation to life as a lesbian. I talked in my first video about how isolating it can be to be a lesbian in queer spaces, and this is no different. Other queer people often see it or portray it as a new form of lesbian separatism or gender criticalness, and that sentiment can be pervasive and used against us. When lesbians say we aren't attracted to men, people will automatically assume that we mean trans women too, even when we're explicitly trans-inclusive, or that it's an inherently exclusionary statement, rather than an attempt at a non-binary inclusive one speaking from experience. And it needs pushing back against, because reactionary thinking isn't just inherent to the right wing, and I see it weaponized a lot against lesbians, mostly in online spaces that breed isolationism. I feel like there's a lot of people within the LGBT community that don't understand what a massive win it is for TERFs if we begin to associate lesbians with them. It's what they want. They want to feel like the champions of the oppressed, and they'll speak over and knock us down while they do it. This is not women being silenced by men. This is not a valid good faith argument. This is yet another attack in a long line of attacks by the British media against trans women. No rational person, trans or otherwise, thinks that anybody should be pressured to have sex with them. Genital preference is absolutely valid, but these arguments are never about genital preference. The argument isn't, I personally don't want to have sex with a pre-op trans woman because she has a penis and I don't like penises. It's, trans women are really predatory men who pretend to be women in order to force us to have sex with them. It's a dangerous lie perpetuated by people who hate trans people. It's straight up bigotry masquerading as protecting a vulnerable minority. And it's exhausting. The BBC continues to profit from art and personalities from the LGBT community while advancing hateful rhetoric. Especially in this country, I fear the media is headed down a path that can only end in a rise of anti-gay sentiment. And trying to cause division between parts of the LGBT community is a big part of that, and very deliberate. The BBC using this article, covered with a few stock photos of women holding hands, is such a slap to the face that it feels like it's already started. State-funded media publishing unquestioned hate of a vulnerable minority is another sign of this country cartwheeling headfirst into fascism.